Well, thank you. This is James Tanner. I'm here for another BYU Library Family History Center Sunday class. The title of this presentation is "Training Your Mind to Think Like a Genealogist," and I think that I just thought that was basically what happened when I began law school back now about probably almost 50 years ago. Basically, the idea that everybody put forth was learning to be a lawyer was learning how to make a sound like a lawyer. In other words, most of what it took to become an attorney, lawyer representing people in court, was raw knowledge and an ability to speak the jargon. In other words, use the terms and the subject matter. That's not quite the same thing that happens with learning any specific type of pursuit. This is an academic pursuit. Genealogy is just pure information. The records, historical records, and historical research, it just involves a lot of reading and a lot of analysis and a lot of time spent trying to understand what relationships and things like that. So there is a lot to learn. And I just thought it'd be interesting to go through some of the things that will be helpful from the very beginnings and kinds of things that are available to learn about becoming and understanding, doing good, let's call it good genealogy. And the first thing is that genealogists need a variety of skills. And in order to go back in find these historical records and take out and extract the information about specific individuals, it's not something you can just do when you just walk into it and look at it, because trying to figure out when and where and how everything happened is quite complex. One of the things that we need to understand as a basis is that genealogy is history and history is genealogy. At the Brigham Young University, there is, and I'll come talk about this a little bit more later, the courses that they have to get a degree in genealogy are all in the history department. I think that's appropriate. That's exactly where genealogy belongs. It's a historical pursuit. And the second you step off into a genealogy website or start to look at family trees and things like that, the first thing you're going to see is dates and places and names and sources and all sorts of information that you need to be able to organize and understand. And it is quite complicated. I have said over the years that if it weren't so complicated to do genealogy, I never would have maintained the interest I have. And I think that's fundamentally true, because if it's really superficial and doesn't have much depth in it, then it's sort of like eating some kinds of popcorn and things like that. There takes an awful lot of popcorn to fill somebody up. So it's just the kinds of things that we need to have that isn't the kinds of pursuit that it is are getting into things that take effort and take a lot of time in some cases. And one of the other things that's particularly important is learning about the history of the places where your ancestors lived. You may think, well, all my ancestors came from the United States. Well, they didn't. And if you go back far enough in your genealogy, you'll find out that eventually they did not. So we're just going to work through and see some of the factors here today about learning and basically getting started with genealogy. Now, part of genealogy is learning a skill in doing research. Now, research is a methodology. It's a way of finding information. Anything you do not know and you spend time trying to find the meaning of or learning about is research. So research methodology, when used term methodology used with research, it says what kinds of things do you do to obtain the information that you're searching for. And that's what it means by saying it's methodology. Well, genealogical methodology involves this process solving analytical and critical thinking skills called research, where you get together with finding the information, locating and identifying information, and then searching through the information for specific information about your particular family, your particular individual that you're trying to find. And it's a learned skill. And I'm going to say that about a lot of things during this presentation. It means that it takes an effort. It's not something you're born with. And it's something you have to learn how to do, whether you learn it when you're young or whether you acquire it later. It's something that you learn. Now, you may think that, well, I'm too old to learn anything. Well, that's not true. There's lots of studies that show that people can learn into old age. Otherwise, where would I be, since I learn things all the day and I'm about as getting as old, as most people consider old. So the purpose here is to begin. And the FH Guide, or the Family History Guide, has an introduction to research. It actually goes through the process of learning how to do research. And so this is a free program. You can go online and begin the process of learning about research. We'll come back to the Family History Guide for a little bit more information about how to learn about genealogical research. But these are all learned skills. Everything I'll talk about today is a learned skill. It takes time and it takes effort. When you were in school, if you took a course in a language, if you were taking English, if you're taking Spanish or German or French or Latin or whatever language you might have taken in your school activities, then you know that learning a language required an effort and repetition and continued research, continued progress. In other words, I've been speaking Spanish my whole life, and yet I still have the word of the day Spanish coming up, so I can obtain a little bit more vocabulary in my understanding of Spanish. So there's lots of ways that the process continues and goes on. Now, there are specific, very specific things that come along with the bundle of information that we attribute to learning about genealogy. First of all, of course, we run into languages. One thing here about nearly everyone, and let me clear up an earlier statement about everyone coming from somewhere. Right now, there's no scientific studies that say that human beings originated in the Americas, and so everybody had to have come here, even if it were thousands of years ago. The issue there is that as we go back in time, we will always, for anyone living here in this country, will always hit the language barrier. You think, well, I speak English and my family all came from England and you need to take a DNA test, or you probably won't say that anymore. But if your family did, in fact, come from an English-speaking country, if you go back a few hundred years in English, you'll find out that you're trying to learn a new language, because English turns into a language called Middle English, and then it turns into a language called Old English, and that is more like Norwegian and some Germanic languages than it is English that we know today. So languages is always one of the things that are involved. The other thing that's going to come along is geography. We understand that anything in genealogy is based on the place where events occurred in people's lives. So almost all records, all genealogical records, are arranged and organized and accessed by location. So understanding geography and the way that countries' borders changed and peoples changed and moved is very important. I have a very simple explanation of the importance of this, and that's there were no records of any Europeans to speak of in what we now live here in Utah before 1847. Why was that? Because there weren't any Europeans living here to speak of before 1847. There are only a few very scattered people, mostly trappers and hunters of the early Europeans that came to this area, and some of the Spanish that walked through. But geography is the big limiting factor for the way that people advance in learning about their ancestors. Paleography, which means studying old handwriting. Handwriting has changed over times and continues to change. I see my grandchildren and I see how they handwrite. Occasionally, I get a little note or something from a grandchild, and I go, "Boy, they sure haven't taught them anything how to write. They can't even write their names properly." So this is something that's going to change a lot more now that almost everything that we do is keyboarded into a computer instead of being written by hand. You can, as I say, metaphorically wring your hands over this and be upset, but it's inevitable that there's changes. And as we go back in time, we find out that reading old handwriting and the specific study of old handwriting, paleography, becomes very challenging and takes considerable amount of effort and repetitious effort to learn how to decipher some of these older handwritings. Then there's just the history itself. There's many, many places in the world where countries have changed. In my lifetime, almost every country in Africa has the different borders and different country name. And around Europe, many of the countries in Europe that I knew about when I was younger have basically either divided up into a number of different countries or have taken on different names. And that goes for lots of other places in the world. And not knowing that history makes it much, much harder to find the records and be involved in those records. You really do need a considerable amount of library science. That means that you're learning how people organize information in libraries and archives. The reason why the basic understanding of how things are organized is how you find the things. And there's lots of finding aids. There are huge finding aids online like worldcat.org, WORLDCAT.org, WorldCat. That's the catalog of a major part of the catalogs of libraries around the world. Even if you never take a class in library science, it's important that you go into libraries and learn how the books are organized and go to archives and learn how you get into an archive. A good example is people talk about doing research at the National Archives of any country and here in the United States. Well, it's a very complex and not very simple a bunch of steps that you have to take before you even get in to look at the books or ask the questions. So these are the kinds of things that are necessary. Now, today, it obviously, much of what we're doing is computerized. And so knowing how to do searches on computers, understanding that software that's necessary and is just computers. And we've added one over the last few years, one or two, and that's the internet and artificial intelligence, or AI. It's a good idea to understand how the internet works and how to do searches on the internet, how to do a Google search, for example. But now we've got another method that's overlaying everything that's called AI. If we don't take the steps to become integrated into that search process, we're going to start to lose our ability to communicate with the greater amount of information out there. Most of the larger online genealogical websites have already been using AI for at least the last 8 or 10 years. And they're not going to stop. They're going to continue to integrate and use AI in the way that they maintain their collections and a lot more. So there's just other minor kinds of things that you have to know something about in order to adequately be able to understand how to proceed with genealogical research. Now, I'm going to have to take some side steps here to get some traction in moving on in this. Before I get too much traction on it, the handouts for these presentations are PDF files that I send to the library, and they put online on the library's website. So yes, there are handouts, and yes, if you request a PDF copy of this, then you have the whole slide deck as your PDF. Now, what about standards? Now, when we talk about standards, we want to know what is good and what is not so good. In other words, is there a better way to do the things that we're doing so that the information that we obtain is usable and accurate and has some relevance to what we wanted to know about our families? I think one thing that genealogy is kind of unique about, maybe not unique in that in a total sense, but at least has a measurably more probability, is that you're going to find out information that you did not want to know. There are things about your family, there are things that that have happened in the past that you simply, you seem like you're better off without knowing them. One of of course, the big things right now is that more and more people are getting DNA tests. And there's a constant stream of stories of people finding their close ancestors, meaning they were adopted and their parents, they were abandoned or whatever, but that they find their biological parents and their biological relatives through DNA testing and through these larger websites. So there's a lot of things going on, but there always has to be something that genealogists have to do to be considered to be a genealogist. In other words, you just sort of trying to do it whatever, and whatever you find is great. If you don't find anything, that's great too. Or are you the kind of person that really wants to dig into it and understand exactly what happened to your family and who they were, and actually do back as far as it's practical to go back in time. But there's got to be something that sets up sort of what's minimally acceptable. Now, this is from what's called the Board for the Accreditation of Genealogists, and it's something that everybody can kind of agree on. And it's Board for Certification. I got that misspoke. Or BCG. So BCG is the Board for Certification. This is a group of people back in Washington, D.C. primarily. Now, there are 5 elements to what they call the genealogical proof standard. Now, you may or may not agree with all of this, but essentially what happens is that this has been around for quite a long while, and it's been revised from time to time. And what it is it kind of gives us an idea of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in genealogical circles, whether you agree with it or not. One of the first elements is a reasonably exhaustive search has been conducted. And some of us get exhausted pretty early on, and so that doesn't really do a lot. But what is intended here is that there are a lot of records that you should be looking at. And if you haven't looked at all the different records, you're not where you need to be on whether or not the information you have is complete and accurate. I have a rule that I use all the time, and that's there's always more records. And it is close to being as true as it could be, because literally there's no one that could live long enough to look at all the records that were necessary or even gain access to all the records. But a reasonably is the qualifier here. And so we aren't looking for exhaustive searches. We're looking to be reasonable. And what's reasonable for you is reasonable for you and maybe not somebody else. But what's reasonable means that you cover what most of the people in the genealogical community would consider to be necessarily reviewed in the progress of doing your genealogical research. This is one that I don't think anybody who has been doing genealogy for any period of time would argue with, that each statement of fact or each assertion of of reality has a complete and accurate source citation. Every time you say something, whether it's telling a birth date or a marriage date or or the names or the or occupations or whatever it is out there that you find about your relatives. We need to know as a community where you got this information so that if we need to duplicate your search, we can readily go to where you say you got the information and verify that what you say is correct. And the next one is that the evidence is reliable and has been skillfully correlated and interpreted. Now, why am I talking about this so early on in the question of what you need to know to be a genealogist? It's for me, it's pretty obvious that unless you understand that genealogy is serious, it's definitely part of an academic subject of history. It's got its place in the world now. And it's absolutely necessary that as we become involved in it, that our ability to discriminate between what we have, what we think, and as pure speculation on what is actual historical knowledge. And so you could restate this section, this particular one, that the evidence is reliable. You could say that you are obtaining information from sources that appear to be primary people who were speaking or did the work to discover what happened at a particular point in time. And then the skillfully correlated and interpreted means that you just didn't put down something that didn't have any particular application. This is a side note, but if you're doing AI research on some of the AI chatbots like Google's Gemini, you can really begin to see why this kind of information is important, because if you ask for a source, you're going to get something that you realize didn't actually have anything to do with what the chatbot said in the first place. And one thing, this goes to a entirely different aspect of genealogical research, and that is that contradictory evidence has either been resolved or acknowledged, and it's whatever your opinion is that you've made your opinion from. If you don't provide the contradictory evidence that you find to what you did, then that's not being honest. It's not being accurate and an honest researcher when there is contradictory evidence. And your conclusions need to be soundly reasoned and coherently written. Well, most of us aren't going to be writing out long explanations of our conclusions. We're not submitting things to genealogical journals, and we're not writing articles and discussing things in that kind of an atmosphere. But it's very helpful if you record your information with your sources in one of the many available online family trees. And I would suggest Family Search, because Family Search is free and allows you to add all that information. But if you don't feel comfortable with Family Search, there's other ones: Ancestry, Find My Past, MyHeritage, and a number of desktop programs. But somehow or another, you need to start getting involved in it directly. And this is kind of important also. Research is something that follows a specific plan, a procedure, and a set of standards and guidelines. So once you have understand those guidelines, then it's important that you do the research consistent with those guidelines and learn enough about what you're doing in order to not simply accept and copy information. If you get back into, for example, here's a good example of what I'm talking about. Let's say that your family tradition is that you were descendants of one of the kings of England or one of the other European countries. And so you get online and you find a pedigree that goes way back and goes to Charlemagne and some other people back in Europe. And you immediately say, oh, great, I know I'm related to this, so I just incorporate my whole genealogy into that line. Well, from that standpoint, you've broken every single suggestive rule of genealogy at that point. There is nothing you've done that is credible, because copying is not genealogy. Just because you copy it out of a book that that seems to agree with what you think or what you want to think is not what creates a genealogist. So basically, someone like me who spent so many years of my life being a trial attorney, I have a skeptical, very skeptical of anybody's assertions that they do without having some kind of specific plan or procedure and sources and things that support their other. So that here the keys are to have a specific plan. What is it you're trying to accomplish as getting into the study of your family history? Do you just have an interest on finding out who your grandparents were, or do you want to go all the way back to somebody that goes back in history? Or are you looking for connection to an Indian tribe, Mayflower, daughters of the American Revolution, something of that nature? Are you interested in it for religious reasons? Are you interested in it because you want to understand more about your own identity? And sorting this out, because at some point in time, genealogy gets exponentially harder to do. It's more and more of the things that I've talked about just so far come into play and make it even more difficult to pursue. So the question is, if your plan or your what you want to do gives you some incentive to spend the time and the effort to actually do. And then you need to set your own standards or guidelines. In other words, what are you going to accept as true and what you're going to accept as genealogy? You're going to try to understand what PCG has to say about reasonably exhaustive search and some of these other things that people have written about and described, and understand those things. And then go ahead and conduct the study. In other words, at some point in time, you actually have to do something. You have to take some steps. I find a lot of people want to learn about their grandparents for their ancestors for a specific reason, but they don't really want to do the work to get the information. They think that somehow in this mass of information we have on the large websites that your pedigree would be magically created just by putting in your name. Well, that may happen someday, but we're not there yet. And it does require some effort and some time spent in looking at the information that's available and learning about what might be more available. Now, this is just kind of another side note here. And one of the things that how you may be starting to get acquainted with your family is that you may go into a website like Family Search. It's free, first of all, and it's very accessible. And registering for the website is minimal. All you have to do is put in your name and an email, and practically speaking. But the problem here is that if you look at it in the context of just names, and you're looking at that as what you know or what you have inherited or what you've been given by your family that says this is the way our genealogy is, you may find that what's in the Family Search family tree is different. What you have is different than what's in the family tree. Well, the problem here is that you need to be more careful. You need to look at all the memories, everything that has been put into the tree, all the sources. Read through the sources. Absolutely. If you don't understand the sources, then there's your start for asking questions of the AI chatbot or doing some Google searches to find out what the words mean and what you're looking at, and the notes that are there and the comments that are there. Now, if you're wanting to learn how to be a genealogist and you want to know the basics of it, there's probably no better way than just getting involved directly, but by looking at all the memories and sources. That will start you understanding that there's a lot more to this than just copying some names out of a book or copying some names off of someone else's family tree, which, by the way, is not genealogy at all. Now, there is really very little formal education for genealogists. It's starting to become more and more available, if you want to call it that. We're having a way to there's more availability, and people that I know personally have availed themselves of getting degrees in genealogy from universities, and that is very helpful. It's not necessary. You can also self-taught. All the information you need to know that would be available to the university's classes would be available to you if you searched on the internet and looked and read and got the information. So what I've putting forth from this point on is the kinds of things that you can use to have a formal training in genealogy, as opposed to the kinds of things that you can use to teach yourself and become proficient in learning about genealogy. Now, it isn't necessary, but it is important to understand that a lot of genealogists who are successful in doing real research and establishing credible pedigrees don't have the formal training, but they have the background from something else. They've been attorneys, they've been accountants, they've been any people involved, librarians, they've been people who have been involved in research and involved in it. Even a lot of science people are attracted to genealogy. A lot of people, just because it's so interesting and so crucial to knowing about your origins, is to when you get into and figure out where all these people are, it makes a lot of things make sense. If you lived in a family that you never could figure out where all these people came from and why they act the way they do, if you start doing genealogy, you'll find out that it's pretty common that some of your ancestors may be just like the people that you grew up with. So here's some ways, some kind of an initial overview of some ways to learn how to be a genealogist. Learning is a lifetime practice, not a single goal. Okay, so it's something that you can start now and learn about. It helps to be a genealogist. Now, you can speak from my own personal background, but I could do that. But I'm not a very good example from that standpoint, because I started back almost 43 years ago, just learning about my family. And first of all, I went many, many years, I'd say 15 or 20 years, before I even realized that other people did genealogy, in the sense that there would be people around me who were interested in doing the same genealogy I was. And I didn't even know there were conferences. I didn't know there were classes. I didn't know that there was some kind of structured way to get into doing genealogy. So I wouldn't recommend doing my way, which was, if you want to say, self-taught for most of the time, until I finally realized that there was a way to learn. And I discovered books on genealogy, which were a great help. And then I spent around 5 years taking online classes from Brigham Young University on family history. And they were some of the hardest classes I ever took. So there's even including law school. And so this was, there was more of a process that became a formal process of learning, and then going to conferences and learning from other genealogists. I had the privilege for spending a number of years where I was able to work closely with other genealogists who were extremely knowledgeable. Some of the people who wrote the original books about genealogy and developed what we know as what we have today. And it was because I was around these people, and because I could watch how they talked, how they worked with their clients. And it was very educational to me. So first of all, it's quite simple. It's in-person classes. Now, you're in an in-person class. If you're listening to this either today while it's being broadcast, or if you're listening to this in the future when it's been put up on the YouTube and the BYU Library YouTube channel, or on the BYU Library Family History Center website, that's where these classes end up. then you're in an in-person class and you're listening to somebody talk about how to do genealogy. That's what you can do. And there's lots of these going on the internet today. There's point out that BYU Library Family History Center now has approximately getting very close to 1,000 videos online. And there's just a massive amount of information available, and we'll see where the rest of that comes from. Now, yes, there are still books, and books still are helpful, and I would strongly recommend that. And we'll get into that a little more. Videos, that's what I was talking about. These in-person classes turn into videos, and they're not just limited to BYU. There's each of the large websites like Family Search and Ancestry and MyHeritage, et cetera, have websites on YouTube with any number of more videos on specific subjects that you want to learn. Mentors, it is extremely helpful when you have someone who will actually sit down with you and help you become proficient in doing some research. And that's, I think, pretty rare. But if you do end up with somebody who's willing to help, then that can be the greatest thing. As I mentioned a moment ago, I kind of got into it in a vacuum. I didn't even know people who, I mean, I'd been doing it for years before I ever actually met a genealogist, somebody who was professional and was actually being a genealogist and getting paid for it. There are genealogical societies all over the world. There are county genealogy societies here in the United States, and over in Europe and all throughout Europe, there are genealogical societies. And these are people who have common interests, and they're more than willing to help, and they have resources. And if you want to have a kind of a social aspect of genealogy, this is a really good way of having the social aspect of doing genealogy. I belong to a local genealogy society here in Provo, Utah, in the Utah Valley, for many, many years. And it is a good association, and it's nice to be around people that kind of have the same interests that you have. And right around now, there's something around 6,000 family search centers. Family Search has established computers that are online to the resources for family search on Family Search, additional to those that are available just by signing into the FamilySearch.org website. And these family centers, there's maps that tell you where they are. If you just do a Family Search Centers map, the search online, you'll find a map of all the Family Search Centers out there. There are now university courses, and I'll cover those that are available right now. And you can volunteer at a Family Search Center or one of the family history libraries. There's ways to get to that you can spend, and then they will do some training, and you'll have some, and it'll be some efforts. Although if you're trying to go to a family search center to simply have them teach you, they may turn around and tell you to teach other people, which is another really good way to learn how to do family history. So just remember that it's a lifelong practice and not a single goal. So now let's hear where we see some places where we can start. I mentioned this before. This is the Family History Guide. It's the fhguide.com. And we have the BYU Family History Center, Library Family History Center. This is the old website. It's being transferred out. It's still available, but we're now getting links to the new website. So there's going to be a transition, and we'll be looking at a new website. And as I mentioned earlier, there's almost 1,000 videos on every possible subject on this website or on the BYU Library Family History Center YouTube channel. Visit a genealogy library. Now, there's two very large genealogy libraries in Utah. There's a number of them across the country. If you do search for genealogy libraries, you'll find that there are huge collections of genealogy and in a lot of libraries across the United States and across Europe and in other countries. And so that's a very good way to get going. Now, do you need to go to the Salt Lake Library to do genealogy? Not so much, but it would be a great experience to go there. I think that if you were in the area and you wanted to make contact, you would get as much out of coming to BYU Library as you would the Family History Library in Salt Lake, except it's big and it's got a bunch of flashy things about it. But it's very nice and very nice. And I spent years of my life in the library. Attend a genealogy conference. Roots Tech 2025 is coming up on March 6th through the 8th. Roots Tech is online right now. If you go to rootstech.org, you'll find that there are well over 1,000. There are thousands of presentations available, all for free. And you can go to the conference. Physically, it'll be held in Salt Lake City at the Salt Palace, March 6th through the 8th of 2025. And National Genealogical Society just held their conference just recently for 2025, but they'll be around and a lot of it will be online, and it may be all online shortly. I always say, don't forget the books. Here's kind of a scattering of books that you might want to get into. The one on the left over there, The Research Guide to American Genealogy by Val Greenwood, was the pivotal book in my learning. I basically got that book and read it from cover to cover and studied it. And it opened up my mind to what I was actually trying to do genealogical research. The other one that was very much influential was The Source. And this is the third edition. There's early editions. The Source is completely been digitized and is online. It's online in the Ancestry wiki. You may never not even known that Ancestry had a wiki, but they do have The Source on there and complete. And this is another example. This is Ancestral Trails. All of these books you can buy online. Some of them are you can buy used for a few dollars. Others are more expensive, but this is the one in for Great Britain. It's the really complete guide to British genealogy and family history. Scandinavian, this is a way to get into Scandinavian. There's guidebooks for almost every other geographic area of the world for how to start, how to do the genealogy, and then there choose one from the Jewish genealogy also. One way, and I've mentioned this already a couple of times, is the BYU Library Family History Center YouTube channel. And right now you see there it has 973 videos, and that was a few days ago that I did this, so it's getting closer to 1,000. And this one will be put up, and that will make it closer. These are formal university level degrees in family history, and I'm going to kind of go through these. I'll mention again that the handouts for these classes are usually a copy of the slides. And so it gives you all the information that's on the slides, and that can be helpful. And if you have any questions, you're certainly welcome to contact the BYU Library Family History Center. We have a virtual help desk. You can call in on a Zoom for free and talk directly to the people in the library, including me, if you can find me. You can't. When I say that, it's because my wife and I work with the library, and we're there only on one shift a week, but we're on our computers almost every day, at least for 8 or 10 or 12 hours. The Brigham Young University in Provo is the only university that offers a 4-year bachelor's degree in family history. And BYU Idaho, which is also part of the same school system, has an applied associate degree, which you can take remotely and gain an associate degree in genealogy. I just thought it'd be interesting to put up the bachelor's in family history, some of the classes. You've got social sciences, technical communication, digital humanities, human geography, mapping your world. You can see all of the things that I said were kind of the subjects that you need to know about are represented here by the courses at the BYU classes for the degree in family history. So this is it's not something I'm just saying. This is actually part of the whole process. This is Strathclyde, and it's over in Glasgow, Scotland, and it's also can be you can also do this remotely from them and obtain a degree. And there's another one. This is an online one, the Institute of Heraldic and Genealogical Studies. They have plenty of information, and they follow through their courses. This is University of Dundee. They offer advanced courses in genealogy, including a master's degree, and I think Strathclyde may also have a master's degree. But this is a master's degree in family history and family studies. And one of my daughters had completed her master's degree through the University of Dundee. University of Limerick. There's a reason why all these are over in London, in England, by the way, in Scotland, because their interest in genealogy is tremendously higher than it is here in the United States. So here's another MA degree. And the Boston University has a genealogy studies program. It's a 7-week program, and go through their program. Some of these cost money. This is Pathway Worldwide, which is a program through BYU, Idaho, Brigham Young University, Idaho, and it gives you a certificate in family history research. Some of these university courses, of course, are going to cost money for tuition, and you need to be kind of prepared for that there is going to be a cost involved. Here in Utah, there's Salt Lake Technical College, and that has, you can see there's the costs. So you could take some degrees, and it depends on the degree you take. So the costs could run from a couple of $300 into a few $1,000s, depending on how much information or things that you want to become. The National Genealogical Society, if you join the society as a member, or join a society that is a member of the National Genealogical Society, which has member societies throughout the country, then there are courses that you can take, and there's genealogy courses. And all I can say is that becoming a genealogist really does take a considerable amount of effort. It's not something that you can just say, I'm a genealogist and go to work. It is something that requires a great deal of effort and time over time. There's always somebody who always says, I wish I could just download all the information that, to me, saying that they want to download all the information in my head. And I would say always what my response is, that you'd have a terrible headache starting out. But it's not that simple because, as I mentioned, I've been doing this now for 43 years. And if I hadn't learned anything, that would be really kind of sad. So it's something that you have to apply yourself and actually spend the effort and time to do it. So keep learning. That's always the admonition. And then thanks for watching. Any questions that I haven't covered? There's one about AI chat. Conversations can be copied and pasted. Let me just make a note that in looking at the different AI chatbots that are out there from Google and from Microsoft and everything, there's the only one that I've found that provides even helpful sources to what they say is Microsoft's Copilot. If you put in a Google one, Claude doesn't have sources either. They may look at really accurate, but unless you go in and find sources for that information, meaning actual documents or references in material that's reliable, it's really not, and it can be way off base. So you just have to be careful. But right now, Microsoft Copilot is the one that will provide you with sources on everything. and you can check it and make sure that it's actually correct. I've had Google Gemini, for example. I've asked questions of Gemini and had them and said, give me a citation. And they give me stuff that's just bogus. It doesn't even apply to what they've said. So it's you got to be careful, really careful with what you use, and don't copy things without having some measure of reliability and credence available. Anything else?
There was a couple of comments under the questions and answers.
It says, so we lay consultants and hobbyists should not say we're genealogists unless we have a formal training. No, I don't know that formal training is necessary to be called a genealogist. I would say that you are a genealogist when people begin to call you a genealogist. It's just like I said earliest in the beginning, that being a lawyer is learning how to make a noise like a lawyer. Well, if you can make a noise like a genealogist and actually help people, I think you're a genealogist. I think that the most expert genealogist that I know in the whole United States, through knowing a lot of people, is somebody nobody knows who they are. They just do their own work. But I know that that person is at least as knowledgeable about doing research in Great Britain as anybody in the United States. So it's not necessary to have a degree.